Penguin Random House Audio presents Home Sweet Home by April Smith. Read for you by Cady McClain. The pale, cold light of the winter sunset did not beautify. It was like the light of truth itself. When the smoky clouds hung low in the west, and the red sun went down behind them, leaving a pink flush on the snowy roofs and the blue drifts, then the wind sprang up afresh, with a kind of bitter song, as if it said, "This is reality, whether you like it or not. All those frivolities of summer, the light and shadow, the living mask of green that trembled over everything, they were lies, and this is what was underneath. This is the truth." Willa Cather, My Antonia. Mercy Medical Center, December 26, 1985, 10 a.m. Rapid City, South Dakota, is a small municipality on the western edge of the state. Originally settled by a band of disillusioned gold miners, a sense of melancholy disappointment still prevails. Despite generations of civic promoters, commerce has never taken hold along its restored frontier streets. December especially does not come easily here. In the winter months, temperatures can hang below zero, in the teens if you're lucky, and continuous storms bring gale-force winds, keeping up a moan of desolation that is peculiar to this place, as if speaking the unspeakable when human voices fail. On Christmas Eve Day, 1985, there had been snow on the ground, but the sky was clear. During the night, the weather changed. Heavy rain began to fall around the same time the police switchboard became flooded with 911 calls. For 2 more days, the skies stayed blustery. Then the rain turned to sleet, which pelted the windshield of Joe Kusek's rental car as she made her way from the airport. 20 years ago, she'd left South Dakota, vowing never to return. As if in retribution, the prairie was drawing her back, this time in the face of a horrific event. The windshield wipers swept the sludge away in crescents. Joe watched as the familiar road became muddled, then sharp, then obscured again by a layer of ice. And that's how it would be for the days ahead, as she tried to grasp what had happened to her family. The whole town was in shock. Her sister-in-law, Wendy Kusek, had been bludgeoned to death with her own steam iron by an intruder on the night of December 24th. Joe's brother, Lance, and their son, Willie, had been savagely attacked as well, and were barely clinging to life. The Kuseks lived on West Boulevard, a genteel enclave of the city's most affluent. Around 7 p.m., one of them had opened the front door of their saltbox house, painted a jaunty blue, assuming it was an early visitor for the annual holiday dinner. The dining room table was decorated with fine china and fresh pine boughs, and a good-sized fire was still blazing in the hearth when police arrived some 50 minutes later, summoned by panicked guests. Locked out with no answer at the door, they'd gone around to the windows and seen the Kuseks lying motionless on the floor in what looked like a massacre. The community hospital that Joe remembered as a small brick building with an ivy-covered portico had become a lumbering medical center. She parked in a cavernous underground lot. Hatless in the frigid air, too distressed to even zip her parka, she followed the arrows to the 4th-floor surgical wing, where she was directed by a solemn nurse to a characterless brown and green waiting room. Murmuring sympathies, a small crowd of people she had known all her life rose to greet her. Cattlemen and ranch wives, the garage owner, her father's political supporters, and the Democratic state chairman. Joe saw fear in their shell-shocked eyes, and not just of the killer or killers, who were still at large. Everyone there had been close to her family, and now they were wrestling with their own guilty consciences. What had been their part in the events leading up to this incomprehensible act? Newspaper and TV reporters were being kept in a separate room. The turnout was familiar to people who knew the Kuseks' story. The national press had swarmed Rapid City before, during her parents' trial. Once again the family made sensational news. Then they'd been fighting for freedom. Now, one by one, they were fighting for their lives. State Trooper Randy Sturgis, retired, was the first to get to Joe. They hugged wordlessly. He'd also been first to befriend the Kuseks when they drove out from New York City, a young family in a second-hand station wagon, back in 1950. 35 years later, he was the same lanky beanpole, but his hair had turned all white, and she could feel a tremor as his hands gripped hers. "Don't lose hope," he said. Joe nodded, although she felt nothing. "The doctor said they really won't know," he added in a husky voice. "Not for a couple of days." "Where is the doctor? I have to talk to him." "Joe," he stopped her. "They're calling in the state investigators. I promise you, we'll get whoever did this." Joe imagined that they would. After so many years, somebody hated her family enough to murder them. The sheriff must have had a pretty good idea of who that could be. Rapid City was still a small town, after all. 1. Dream. Chapter 1. The station wagon was stuck in the mud, and Joe's parents were trying to fix it. This was before State Trooper Randy Sturgis showed up to rescue them. Joe was 4, and her brother Lance, still a baby. They had driven almost 2,000 miles from New York City, passed through Sioux Falls, and crossed into the grasslands, a couple of hours shy of their destination at the Crazy Eights Ranch. The highway here was newly built, and every time the sun came out, the road became a beckoning river of silver. Joe's father had been driving. He was a lawyer who still wore his hair city-style, slicked back with Vitalis, and he had a dashing mustache that made a thin line over soft, ample lips. He was a confident fellow of 37, big-boned and good-looking, with a narrow face, sandy hair, eyes typically narrowed in thought, and a long, straight, aristocratic nose. His plain decency made Calvin Kusek someone you would trust, foreman of the jury, the passenger who takes charge when the subway car breaks down. He was sure of himself in a quiet way that inspired others to follow. It was early spring, 1950. The world as Cal Kusek saw it had lost its innocence and was facing grave dangers. Just last year, Truman announced that the Soviet Union had detonated an atomic bomb. Now, both sides had it. A believer in old-fashioned, cracker-barrel democracy, Cal was fed up with Senator Joe McCarthy running roughshod over civil rights, yet gaining in power. Unstable times called for level-headed choices, which is how the Kuseks came to leave Manhattan for the heartland of America. "I always imagined the prairie would be flat and dull," Joe's mother Betsy had said. "But this is beautiful." "Isn't it, though?" Cal agreed. "Real live nature, the way it's supposed to be," he added in a carefree voice that made the endless days in the car sound like a song. The trip had started on a buoyant note. When both kids had finally quieted down in the back seat, and the steel cables of the George Washington Bridge were winging by overhead, the Kuseks touched hands in the natural way of married people and, without having to say a word, affirmed their love and the rightness of their purpose, heading west in order to find a better life for their children. From the beginning,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?